I'm Darren Byler. I'm an assistant professor of international studies here at Simon Fraser, and really happy to have Thiti here. But before I introduce my speaker, I wanted to just say something about the land that we're on now, that we're on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, which is the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and other peoples that are, whose land is here and have never given it away, and we are here occupying their territory. We're living in a settler colony, and it's important to keep that in mind, at all times, and also to practice forms of decolonization in our daily life, and in the ways we think about politics. Our talk today speaks about colonialisms and postcolonialism or anti-colonial action elsewhere in the world, but I think we can think about parallels to what's happening here. I introduce our speaker, who is Thiti Jamkajornkeiat.
Great job.
It's 4 syllables. He's an assistant professor of global Southeast Asian studies at the University of Victoria. Hi, y'all. Where he teaches courses on activism, human rights, public humanities, and anti-colonialism in 20th and 21st century Asia. His essays and interviews have appeared in the Kyoto Review of Southeast Asia, Spectre, Haymarket Books, and he has forthcoming projects in Verge, Global Asia, and Position Politics. He works at the intersection of Marxism, post-colonialism, anti-colonialism, decolonial theories, and Southeast Asia, and specifically focuses his attention on Indonesia and Thailand. His first book project is an intellectual history about peripheral Marxist theorization of Indonesian left internationalism in the long 60s, with an emphasis on the left, third-worldist, and minor communist modalities of internationalism. And I think his talk is going to focus on some of that book project. The title of his talk today is Left Third-Worldist Indonesia during the Post-Colonial Interregnum, Ibrahim Isa, and the Theorization of Circulation Struggles. So, turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. As Darren also was doing the acknowledgement of the land, I wish to also use the moment of gratitude to commemorate the Indonesian communists and Southeast Asian leftists at large who were murdered because of their dream for the better world without capitalist exploitation and imperialist domination. Good evening, friends at the Simon Fraser Universities. Thank you, Darren, for your invitation and hard work in bringing it all together. The David Lam Center for hosting, and School for International Studies and Global Asia program for co-sponsoring. My talk today, as you can see on the slide, entitled Left Third-Worldist Indonesia during the Postcolonial Interregnum, Ibrahim Isa and the Theorization of Circulation Struggles, has 4 following sections. First, I will describe the significance of the time frame of this study from 1955 to 1965 in Indonesia and its relation to decolonization. Second, I will discuss the geographical scope of the study that involves the Third World, Indonesia, and West Papua. Third, which is the centerpiece of this presentation, I will analyze thoughts and actions of one Indonesian internationalist, Ibrahim Isa, and what I argue as his most important contributions to Marxist and postcolonial theories, namely left third-worldism and circulation struggles. And I know that some of you here are also have stakes in this debate. I'm looking at you, Alberto. So, looking forward to a vigorous conversation afterwards. I draw my presentation today from a chapter in my book manuscript in progress. Lastly, I will conclude by situating this presentation in my latter research project. Before getting to the first section, let me give you a summary of what I'm going to present. I am using an intellectual historical approach to analyze political discourses of an Indonesian internationalist, Ibrahim Isa, on the West Papua question. I will show that underlying Ibrahim Isa's thoughts and actions is a specific strand of Marxism emerging out of the global South, called Left Third-Worldism, that has not yet been a topic of systematic study. This left third-worldism presupposes a Marxist understanding of the world as an intertwined capitalist and imperialist system, materially connected by the logistical infrastructure, like military bases, seaports, and in the language of that time, which we will see, aerodromes or airports. I will likewise demonstrate that despite the tightly connected material base of this capitalist imperialist system, left third-worldism emphasizes the global solidarity of port workers who can disrupt this system through what I call circulation struggles by striking at the vulnerable joints that link different nodes in this larger system. I argue that left third-worldism and circulation struggles, both premised on a Marxist lineage of using a link figure in conjunctural analysis, dialectically constituted a primary contradiction during the postcolonial interregnum. Section 1. The whole decade of Indonesian history from 1955 to 1965 occupies a special position in larger trajectories of global anti-colonial and communist movements. It was a decade that the possibilities for transforming the world into one without imperialist subjugation, capitalist exploitation, and racial discrimination were felt as imminent. Indonesian radicals and revolutionaries were at the forefront of these transformations, not just within Indonesia, but also overseas. The Afro-Asian Conference, where 29 African and Asian leaders convened in the Indonesian city of Bandung in 1955, inaugurated this revolutionary decade. Though having a celebratory beginning, this decade ended with a tragedy that casted a catastrophic impact on global anti-colonial and communist movements. This tragedy was no other than the genocide, or more accurately put by Australian political scientist Max Lane, ideologicide, of roughly 1 million Indonesian communist members. The genocide eliminated communist bodies as much as it extinguished anti-capitalist knowledge. It henceforth inaugurated a radically different pattern of capitalist accumulation in Indonesia, freed from leftist opposition. All the revolutionary possibilities accumulated throughout the decade have been stultified and precluded from getting realized. As a recent transnational study of this genocide by Vincent Bevins shows, Washington was implicated in this killing, and this anti-communist counterinsurgency scheme named Jakarta has been implemented against leftist governments in other parts of the third world. So you can see the three books. Most to the left is the book that tried to study or call the massacre of the left in Indonesia as a genocide, and then Max Lane book that I draw the idea of ideologicide from is in the middle, and then the most right is Vincent Bevins' world-renowned book. Let me illustrate my point about imminent transformational possibilities by referring to the most iconic and indeed most luminous Indonesian figure treating the anti-colonial path in global politics, President Sukarno. Already in the title of his only speech at the United Nations General Assembly in September 1960, to view the world anew, the hopeful sentiment and the firm belief about global transformational possibilities show through. Far from a naive third world romanticism, Sukarno's fiery speech was fully conscious of the old world violence. It harshly criticized the United Nations for inheriting the Western state system, premised on the world-destroying imperialist impulse. Sukarno delivered as the following. You can read together. Can you wonder that so many of us look at this organization, the UN, which is also a product of the Western state system, with a question in our eyes? We have been inspired by the words of Lincoln and of Lenin, by the deeds of Washington and by the deeds of Garibaldi. But we are determined that our nations and the world as a whole shall not be the plaything of one small corner of the world. We do not seek to defend the world we know. We seek to build a new world. We seek to build a world sane and secure. We seek to build a world in which all may live in peace. We seek to build a world of justice and prosperity for all men. Sorry for the gender-based language. We seek to build a world in which humanity can achieve its full stature. More than name-dropping, Sukarno deeply studied both discourses and practices of these Western figures to derive lessons for building Indonesia. But coming from a colonized country, he knew full well that Western political thought was flawed on a particular question, colonialism. Though I strongly disagree on Sukarno's lumping of Lenin into this genealogy without fully considering Lenin's contribution on anti-imperialism, Sukarno raised a noble point about the world not being the plaything of Europe, or increasingly so in the post-war milieu, the United States. The contestation in Sukarno's understanding between the dying old world and the emerging new world effectively encapsulated what Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called interregnum, when the old is dying and the new cannot be born. Notice the temporal implication of the term seek. The term implies a process and a direction towards the future. A new world was both sought for and at the same time in the process to be built. Indeed, everyone knows the creation of a new world is never an easy and straightforward task. In fact, it's a task generally deemed impossible. But the fact that Sukarno, along with other previously colonized peoples, dare to dream seditiously, to use the language of Martinican thinker Ibrahim Isa, for building a new world, tells us about how much the old world was uninhabitable. It was difficult to breathe. As another revolutionary Martinican, Frantz Fanon, would say, if anything, one has to recognize own limits in participating in this world-creating project, that one cannot undertake it alone. It requires an international collaboration among the decolonizing peoples of the world, whose political projects have multiple manifestations. The international collaboration centrally pivoted around Indonesian geographical and historical specificities is what I am going to demonstrate in this talk, through zeroing in on thoughts and actions of one prominent Indonesian internationalist, Ibrahim Isa. Section 2. The period immediately after the Second World War, which I call the period of postcolonial interregnum, witnessed an active organizing of leftist movements around the world. There were 4 major approaches for the global revolution around that period, and it's very rough and reductive. I apologize all the Marxists out there. The Soviet Union and its faithful followers promoted the struggle for peace as opposed to American nuclear aggression. The People's Republic of China took a more militant route by way of peasant revolts at the domestic level and a method of encircling the metropoles from the global countryside at the international level. National liberation movements executed their guerrilla warfare to drive the colonizer away from their territories. Lastly, the global North working class, particularly in Italy, reinvigorated workers' insurgency as a political praxis autonomous from trade unions and the party. I would ask the audience to take a pause to look at this quote from 1962 by Ibrahim Isa, who I will introduce in greater details shortly, and think, how does it fit into these existing revolutionary approaches? And let's read together because it is a lot of text. On behalf of the Indonesian people, I call upon the workers of Port Said, Suez Canal, Cairo Airport, Beirut Airport, Damascus, Casablanca, Tunis, Baghdad, Bahrain, Dhahran, Karachi, Bombay, New Delhi, Colombo, Rangoon, Bangkok, Tokyo, Tacubaya, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Manila, and other workers of airports and harbors in all Asian and African countries. And you think he would stop there, but it's not yet. I call upon the workers in the Panama Canals and other Latin American countries. I call upon the workers and the people of Australia who have demonstrated their solidarity during the National Liberation War with the Indonesian people. I call upon all these brave workers and peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America and Australia to boycott any Dutch ships and aeroplanes used to transport reinforcements and military equipment to West Irian. I call upon these brothers in the event of war between Indonesia and Dutch imperialism to boycott every Dutch ship passing through their countries. There were no calls for peace. Neither were calls for peasant revolts. The mentioning of guerrilla warfare was nowhere to be found, and the global North workers were out of sight. In fact, both the Soviet Union and China were curiously, or rather expectedly, absent from this list of global logistical choke points. Rather than Communist Party members or anti-colonial state leaders as of customary, port workers across 4 continents were invoked as exemplary anti-colonial agents who could powerfully stop the entire capitalist and imperialist flows when working together in solidarity. Isa invoked the 4 continent workers to support the Indonesian struggle in resisting the Dutch continuing occupation of West Papua, or its name at that time, West Irian. In this formulation, Indonesia became the third worldist center for the global revolution, not just a marginal insignificant participant without a rippling impact to other parts of the world. It was also not just another local manifestation of a global phenomenon. Instead, it co-constituted this global phenomenon called the revolution in a back and forth interaction between the Indonesian part and the international whole. The notion of the co-constitution of the global here is my method of overcoming the local and global binary, common in many conventional area studies frameworks, that leads to problematic phenomena of isolationism and expansionism, or nativism and hegemony. As you might expect, I could not find resemblances between the analysis and oppositional strategy offered in this quote with any actually existing forms of leftism during the period of postcolonial interregnum. A heavy reliance on workers immediately associated with a Marxism of sorts. The question then is, what kind of Marxism is it when the attributes of Soviet, Chinese national liberation and global North workerist Marxisms do not quite capture the essences of this quote? This is where I intervene and propose that what we observe here is another form of Marxism in the period of postcolonial interregnum that I call Left Third-Worldism. Left Third-Worldism, as I will show, is a Marxism premised on an understanding of the world as an intertwined capitalist and imperialist system that in turn causes uneven global geographical and historical formations. I also suggest that the resisting strategy of boycotting ships and planes at the logistical choke points unique to, but in no way monopolized by, Left Third-Worldism illuminates a new kind of struggle, which I name circulation struggles. I will provide a more comprehensive analysis of Left Third-Worldism and circulation struggles when they show up again in a fuller context of Isa's anti-colonial discourses and practices. For now, let me turn your attention to another work that this quote does in terms of remapping the world. When all the locations that Isa mentioned in the quote are plotted on a map, a different world cartography began to emerge. An anti-colonial cartography that links sites of third world anti-colonial struggles together. This anti-colonial cartography gives a sense of international scope of the kind of Left Third-Worldism dealt with in this talk. At least at an affective level, Indonesia could immediately display solidarity with other third world workers and advance any causes for that decolonizing world into reality, actualizing the first step in, to bring Sukarno back here, building the world anew. There was no way for colonial transports, whether through sea or air, to arrive at the third world without going through ports in the third world themselves. And even more ironically, it was the third world workers who operationalized these ports on the ground. Canal operators, longshoremen, wharf-fingers, stevedores, flight dispatchers, and ground attendants. To accentuate labor that energizes these ports is to at once expose the material basis of imperialist network infrastructure and capitalist supply chain, and reveal the possibility for solidarity between these workers that has been hindered by the system. The context in which I'm investigating Isa's Left Third-Worldism cannot be more controversial, back then as well as now. The context in question was the status of West Papuan sovereignty. For those whose West Papuan controversy does not strike as apparent, it is similar to mentioning Okinawa to Japan scholars, or Xinjiang to China scholars. Indeed, the complexity of each prevents an easy analogy. The simplest way to summarize the issue is that West Papua itself points to the limits of Indonesia as a project of anti-colonial nation. The West Papuan desire for sovereignty has been discounted by both the Dutch and the Indonesians, who have different political agenda in holding on to West Papuan territory. The agreement that obligated the Dutch to transfer sovereignty to Indonesia in 1949 did not resolve the West Papuan question. while the Dutch justified its continued administration of West Papua by emphasizing the racial difference between the Papuans and the Indonesians. Anti-colonial Indonesians pushed the idea of national unification, in which West Papua constituted an irreplaceable part. The West Papuan issue is indeed more complex than the conflict between the Dutch and the Indonesians. Multiple political actors were involved, including the United States and the United Nations. Told from the West Papuan independence movement perspective, however, the whole discussion would be totally different. I am spending time to clarify the West Papuan controversy here for two reasons. First, I am aware about the controversy revolving West Papua. And second, I find this issue instructive to both illuminate the emancipatory dimension of Left Third-Worldism and pinpoint its limits and contradictions. Here, the perspective into which I enter the West Papuan question is a specific one, namely Left Third-Worldism. My focus here is on Left Third-Worldism, not West Papua. Ibrahim Isa formulated this view, and I extrapolated from Isa. This is the only perspective on which I am focusing in this presentation. It is here that I am briefly reminding the audience of the merit of recuperating Ibrahim Isa and his Left Third-Worldism. The ideology side of the Indonesian left has effectively put this conceptual way of thinking into extinction. The demise of the Third Worldist movement at large from the 1970s onwards no less contributed to the relative loss of this analytical mode. After I have demonstrated section 3, after I have demonstrated the significance of the 1955 to 65 time period and the geographical scope of Left Third-Worldism, as well as the Papuan questions, in other words, the temporal and spatial coordinates of my talk, I am now transitioning to the core of my presentation about Indonesian internationalist Ibrahim Isa, and what I argue as his most important contribution to Marxist and postcolonial theories, namely Left Third-Worldism and circulation struggles. And here is an image of a cover of his memoir, Bui Tanpa Jarak Besi, or Prison Without Bars. During the period focused in this presentation, Ibrahim Isa represented Indonesia at the Permanent Secretariat of the Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization, or APSO, in Cairo, Egypt, from 1960 until the anti-communist government of Suharto revoked his passport in 1966. APSO itself was established in 1957 by Asian and African leftist activists who found the Bandung Conference too conciliatory and too focused on the political elites. Like his other Indonesian contemporaries, Isa discerned multiple transformational possibilities around him. He decided to move to Cairo as the Indonesian representative with a conviction to put Indonesia on the map as one center of global decolonization, fulfilling oneself Sukarno's vision of Indonesia. And when I was giving this talk at UVic, I also just learned that the position that I replaced, which is Michael Bowden, who is Indonesian, a specialist on Indonesian theater and literature, was also having an interview with Ibrahim Isa in Amsterdam before. So this was sort of a site of contact between me and Ibrahim Isa. It was also through Michael Bowden, but Isa already passed away in 2014. So it was only through the photo and through the memories of Bowden about Isa that I learned more about the personal character of Isa. In my view, Ibrahim Isa, a relatively unknown figure, not just internationally but also in Indonesia, vanished from history when he became an exile in China and later the Netherlands, a fate shared among other Indonesian exiles. A mere handful of transnational Indonesian historians who are already interested in the anti-colonial networks like Catherine McGregor, Vanessa Hiernan, Tamo Zhou, and Wildan Sena Utama only began to reference Isa in their studies. Outside of the scholarly realm, less than 5 leftist platforms like popular history journal Historia, online history outlet Tirto, and online library Perpustakaan Online Genocida gave sketches of Isa's different phases in life. Despite being unfairly neglected, Isa's role as a representative to APSO gave him extraordinary access to leftist Afro-Asian and later tricontinental circuits that no other Indonesians could ever attain. More than being a crucial hinge between Indonesia and the rest of the decolonizing world, or a key to realizing Indonesia's status as a third world revolutionary center, I suggest that Isa's intellectual discourse gives us insights to the capitalist and imperialist maneuvers along with ways to oppose them from a perspective of a maritime third world nation in the period of postcolonial interregnum. I would go so far as to claim that we ought to treat his ideas as seriously as other anti-colonial theorists, like Amilcar Cabral or Frantz Fanon, to think about the internationalism that third world thinkers could offer. It was, after all, from focusing on Isa's discourse that allowed me to further articulate the left third-worldist form of Marxism. While a comprehensive biographical study of Isa, let alone an intellectual biography, is non-existent, it could be surmised that sources of Isa's insightful analysis of the capitalist and imperialist world came from a combination of autodidacticism and his concrete experience rather than from the books. This is a pattern that can be observed from many third world activists who are occupied with changing the world around them. They form their subjectivities in the struggle. They learn sophisticated ideas in practice rather than purely in theory. It is now time to learn more about who is this fairly low-key, almost self-vanishing figure named Ibrahim Isa. Ibrahim Isa bin Gelar Datuk Sinaro Panjang was born in Mesir Cornelis in Jakarta on August 20, 1930. He got his title from his Minangkabau, West Sumatran father, who bore the same name. His mother, Nila Utama, came from the South Sumatran city of Mukomuko in Bengkulu province. Isa's father's position as a teacher enabled Isa to attend the Dutch primary school, Europees Laguerre School, or ELS. Sorry for my Dutch. But Isa was enrolled for only one day, as he had difficulties speaking fluent Dutch, unlike his older siblings. He moved to Verswolds Law School, or continuation school equivalent to a higher division of primary school, a colonial school with a mission to produce low-level bureaucrats. Before even starting school, the Japanese army arrived and shut down all the Dutch institutions. Isa changed school again to an Islamic Muhammadiyah school. When the Japanese left at the age of 15, Isa enlisted to the People's Security Army of Tentara Keamanan Rakyat, an embryo of what later became the Indonesian Armed Force, to fight against the Dutch reoccupation of Indonesia after the war. One of his biographers claimed that the first political book Isa read was a travelogue, Dari Penjara ke Penjara, or From Jail to Jail, by another prominent Indonesian internationalist and political dissident, Tan Malaka. His brother-in-law journalist and one of the founders of the first post-independence Indonesian newspaper, Berita Indonesia, SM Syaf, lent this book to Isa. After the Dutch reoccupation war ended, Isa became a teacher at the Sulawesi Regional Association School, KRIS, or Kebaktian Rakyat Indonesia Sulawesi, in Jakarta, and then at the same time, the KRIS Foundation General Secretary. It was here that Isa briefly overlapped with the future Indonesian President Abdurrahman Wahid, or Gus Dur, who remembered and looked for the exiled Isa in the Netherlands in one of his state trips. As an educator activist with first-hand knowledge of youth struggles, Isa, so this is where it becomes more interesting. Isa was selected by the Indonesian Peace Committee, or Komite Perdamaian Indonesia, in August 1952 to attend the World Federation of Democratic Youth preparatory meeting in Copenhagen, Denmark. After this internationalist debut, Isa became more involved with the Indonesian Peace Committee as its executive. He had no records of formal affiliation with any Indonesian political parties, even as he was very close to some key communist figures like the Indonesian Communist Party, or PKI's Vice Chairman Nyoto, and we can see in this photo of Ibrahim Isa at the right with sunglasses, with the Indonesian Communist Party Vice Chairman Nyoto at the middle also wearing glasses. Because of his association with the Peace Committee, which worked closely with the leftist Afro-Asian activists who founded APSO, Isa was chosen as the Indonesian representative. His concrete experience of being in the Left Third-Worldist circuit enabled him to later produce a uniquely Left Third-Worldist discourse on the West Point question. In this way, Isa represents a left third-worldist strand of the Indonesian radicalism, who sides with the Indonesian Communist Party, but does not become the party member. Isa was not alone as a left third-worldist. Other left third-worldist figures, as I'm able to track, include the Peace Committee's Women's Department head named Utami Surya Dharma, and the chair of Afro-Asian Journalists Association, who later fled to Beijing, named Jawoto. After his passport was revoked in 1966, Isa and his family fled to the PRC and then the Netherlands in 1986. In China, Isa continued his left third-worldist work in the Research Institute of Asia Africa by being an editor of Indonesian Afro-Asian periodical called Oisra Bulletin. The main political agenda of this bulletin was to expose the anti-communist atrocity of the Suharto regime. So then you can see this picture of Isa and his other Indonesian leftist exiles in the Afro-Asian Writers' Meeting at the Great Wall. I mean, it happening in Beijing, but they were having this excursion to the Great Wall. The conference is happening at the Great Wall. In the Netherlands, Isa became an active member of various justice and cultural organizations, including the Amnesty International, Indonesian History and Culture Foundation, and the Wertheim Foundation, named after the Dutch Marxist Indonesianist Wim Wertheim. Among all these organizations, he was devoted to assisting the Institute for the Struggle for 1965 Victims, or Lembaga Perjuangan Koran 1965, in helping other exiles abroad and campaigning against the Suharto's government. He passed away in the Netherlands, what's that, 7 years ago? 7 years ago, 2016. To better appreciate Isa's engagement with the West Papuan question in Cairo, let me give you a textual case of a kind of encounter that Isa had as reconstructed from his memoir. At a friendship gathering of Pertemuan Silaturahmi organized by the Indonesian Embassy in Cairo in the summer of 1961, Isa had a conversation with Cairo's old face, Muka-Muka Lama, about the liberation of West Papua. Indonesian ambassador to Egypt, Sanusi Haryadinata from the Indonesian Nationalist Party initiated this event for the Indonesians in Egypt, particularly the Muslim students at Al-Azhar University, to socialize. This old face Isa mentioned referred to Saleh Bawasir, the trilingual Middle Eastern correspondent of the Indonesian National News Agency Antara. As an Indonesian of Hadrami Arab descent, Bawasir was fluent in Indonesian, Arabic, and English. The conversation between Isa and Bawasir revolved around President Sukarno's utterance in early 1960. Sukarno's words went as the following. Before the rooster crowd in 1960, West Irian would already be at the motherland's lab. Sebelum ayam jantan berkokok pada tahun 60, Irian Barat sudah berada di pangkuan Ibu Pertiwi. Regarding this utterance, Bawasir told Isa that he felt annoyed when some of his fellow Egyptian reporters teased him by questioning the credibility of this speech. They asked with a ridiculing tone, "The rooster has already crowed several times, but West Irian is still under Dutch control. How many more times does the rooster have to crow?" But Bawasir counterattacked with a response, and it is still a very timely response up until today, listening to this. I guarantee in front of you that West Irian will be liberated before the Palestinians are liberated from Israel's domination and occupation. That was in 1960. Regardless of Bawasir's hot temper, what appeared as his impulsive statement became true. West Papua became liberated from the Dutch a few years after, and it was no other than Ibrahim Isa, who industriously mustered Third World Solidarity to pressure the Dutch from outside Indonesia. There are 2 points worth noting from this encounter. First, the notion of returning Dutch-occupied West Papua to the Indonesian motherland presupposed a newly invented idea of national unification, undergirding the Indonesian anti-colonial movement. From the Indonesian anti-colonial perspective, the continued existence of Dutch colonialism in the archipelago threatened not just the Indonesian sovereignty, but also the anti-colonial struggles worldwide. Since the Bandung Conference 1955, the liberation of West Papua from Dutch colonialism had always been Indonesian official international line. Indonesia's third world allies warmly acknowledged and supported this idea. The term neocolonialism that has been globally attributed to French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre and Ghanaian political theorist Kwame Nkrumah might have been first deployed in 1961 APSO Council meeting in Bandung to discuss the neo-colonial situation in West Papua. This is to say, in ways more than one, West Papua is central to the conceptualization of both global imperialism and capitalism, anti-colonialism and Marxism. Second, the comparison between West Papua and Palestine and Dutch imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism, as I will show, continue into Isa Left Third-Worldist analysis of and resistance to capitalism and imperialism. Further along in his memoir, Isa narrated that he thought of his mission in Cairo as a conjoining of the national campaign to liberate West Papua with larger Afro-Asian anti-colonial struggles for independence. In fact, Isa took some time to research on an effective frame to link the West Papuan question with Arab-Asian struggles while he was on duty in Cairo. So in the photo, you already see an image of Isa discussing with African diplomats about the Indonesian liberation of West Papua, Cairo. This is in 1962. And this is the photo of Isa when he is presenting his speech on West Papuan liberation at the APSO gathering in Cairo. The result of his research, Isa's research, culminating in his 12-page long speech delivered on the night of January 8, 1962. On that night, the Afro-Asian Peoples Solidarity Organization's Permanent Secretariat called a public meeting devoted to supporting the Indonesian struggle for West Papuan liberation from Dutch colonization, featuring Isa as a presenter. This speech offered key theoretical insights to left third-worldism and its oppositional strategy of circulation struggles that I have been suggesting throughout the presentation. Immediately at the speech title, which you can see here, The Liberation of West Irian and Imperialist Maneuvers in the Middle East, Isa already highlighted the connection between West Papuan liberation and Arab-Asian anti-colonial struggles in the Middle East. The term maneuvers capture the sense of logistical operations fundamental to the transoceanic kind of imperialism that Isa investigated. To further foreground the Indonesian people's solidarity with Egypt, Isa started his speech by referring to the tripartite British-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956 Suez Crisis. He showed that Indonesian activists organized mass demonstration and public meetings condemning the tripartite aggression and set fire to the British embassy in Jakarta. And why British embassy? Because it was the previous colonizer of Egypt. Isa then described different executions of Dutch colonialism. Among them is cooperation with the regional comprador elite to overthrow the Indonesian government. Dutch neocolonialism, Isa argued, worked hand in hand with other remaining and emerging colonial powers, particularly the US as well as their economic blocs. Isa gave an example of US imperialism, which supplied financial and military support for the Dutch and the Zionist Israel to continue their occupation of West Papua and Palestine. He wrote, quote, "Today, US imperialism is the ringleader of all reactionaries in the world," end quote. About a quarter of the speech, Isa quoted APSO Solidarity's statement on West Papua released a month earlier, presumably written also by Isa himself, to support his left third-worldist analysis of capitalism and imperialism. We can read this together. At the present moment, the Dutch colonialists, strongly supported by the US and other imperialists, are concentrating their efforts to liquidate physically the national liberation movement in West Irian and to further establish a puppet state of the so-called state of Papua. At the same time, Dutch military reinforcement is flowing to West Irian. Experience repeatedly shows that the colonialists and imperialists will never voluntarily give up their colonies and exploitation. They will not understand the aspiration of the peoples to be free unless they are forced to do so. It's timely then as well as now. Despite the seeming absence of the analytical influences from either the Soviet or Chinese Communist parties, the analysis of imperialism and capitalism structural tendencies here closely resemble the CCP's or Chinese Communist Party militant line, rather than the CPSU or the Soviet Union Communist Party non-aggressive peaceful line. This APSO quotation characterized imperialism as structurally violent and motivated by power and profit. The Dutch-US transimperial alliance aimed to physically liquidate the national liberation in West Irian, as you can see there. Liquidate physically, military reinforcement, as I have highlighted. They call for military reinforcement. They would not voluntarily give up their colonies and exploitation. They needed to be driven out by force. Let's continue with the quotation. The liberation of this territory from imperialist yoke will eliminate another hotbed of war and thus promote peace and security in this area. The Permanent Secretariat calls especially upon the peoples and the workers in the harbors and aerodromes of Asian and African countries to boycott any Dutch ship and aeroplane used to transport troops, reinforcement, and military equipment to West Irian. Understanding that Dutch imperialist existence in West Papua only triggered war and threatened peace, this passage linked the liberation from imperialism in one world region to an elimination of one war possibility, bringing the world one micro step closer to a specific conception of peace. Not the peace that endorsed the coexistence of imperialist and capitalist aggressor and their potential victims, so that's the Soviet conception of peace. This specific conception of peace aimed to abolish the capitalist and imperialist system that caused aggression in the first place, so that aggression would no longer be an issue, and this is the CCP's conception of peace. The APSO Solidarity Statement also called on Afro-Asian peoples and workers for circulation struggles, just like the quote that I have referred to early on in this presentation. Let me slow down to explain what I mean by circulation struggles, which were here manifested through a boycott form. Geographies of Indonesia as an archipelagic colony and the Netherlands as a seafaring empire meant that the ocean was their primary economic and military contact zones. This in turn necessitated the ocean, along with all the logistical operations and related transportation networks, to be sites of anti-colonial subversion and colonial counterinsurgency. Oops. Oh, it's a wrong version. Okay. Anyways, I follow scholars. I'm thinking whether I should change. Okay, it's the wrong version. I had some more slides, but I'll just say it here. I follow scholars like Deborah Cohen and Joshua Clover to call this transoceanic collision circulation struggles. Circulation struggles register acts of resistance, aiming to disrupt the coordinated yet overstretched and vulnerable circuits of imperialist network infrastructure and capitalist supply chain, specifically at their concentrated key sites or choke points. To situate the explanation of circulation struggles earlier in the context of American neocolonialism in the period of postcolonial interregnum, I am referring to another text that I consider to be a Left Third-Worldist manifesto, the CCP's 1965 People's War. The People's War text analyzed expansive US imperialism as, quote, overreaching itself and dispersing its strength with its rear so far away and its supply lines so long, end quote. In this sense, People's War understood US imperialism as a seriality of overreached supply lines similar to other leftist macro analyses of global imperialism and capitalism that share the language of network, circulation, and link, which include Lenin and Trotsky weakest link, Samir Amin's delinking, or Jasper Burns' counter-logistics. Because US imperialism was already overstretched and vulnerable, People's War contend that waging multiple coordinated wars on it at different key sites would significantly weaken and split up this imperialist whole. People's War solution of multiple wars, Lenin and Trotsky weakest link, Amin's delinking, and APSO and Isa's boycotting all operate on the same dialectical logic, striking the uneven imperialist capitalist system that appears invincible at its vulnerable joints. Let me repeat this. Striking the uneven imperialist capitalist system that appears invincible at its vulnerable joints. Conceiving US capitalist empire as a giant uniform structure may deceive one into thinking that it is invincible, while understanding it as a seriality allows one to strike it apart at the vulnerable joints. Isa issued an ultimatum for circulation struggles after his citation of the Afro Solidarity statement. In a quote we already read together earlier, he single-handedly mapped out every single node in the violent imperial cartographies, where Asian, African, Latin Americans, and Australian workers could disrupt the Dutch-US imperialist lifeline and capitalist flow in support of the West Papuan liberation. These left third-worldist calls for circulation struggles accomplished two tasks. First, they established momentary social space of worker insurrection and internationalist solidarity within the uneven capitalist cartography. Deborah Cohen alerts us to the productive consequences of disruption caused by circulation struggles that, quote, signals a creative destruction that brings new possibilities into the world, end quote. Even as I could not track solidarity actions responding to Isa's particular call in this speech, it is safe to assume that Isa made this call based on positive results in recent histories. One example was the Egyptian workers' blockade at the Suez Canal and Australian seamen's strike at Fremantle Harbour, Perth, in solidarity with the Indonesians to prevent the Dutch aircraft carrier Cairo to show her flag in West Papua in the middle of 1960. Second, they cracked open the weak links or vulnerable joints in the capitalist imperialist system to split it up. Unlike production struggles narrowly construed through activities like labor strike or armed struggles that may lead to systemic change, circulation struggles, which can also be argued as the realm of expanded production, have to be assessed on their occlusive capacity that prevents imperialism and capitalism from achieving absolute domination. It was Ibrahim Isa's analysis of West Papuan question that articulates a left third-worldist understanding of imperialism and capitalism, along with the oppositional strategy of circulation struggles. The follow-up question many contemporary Marxists may ask is, how to collectively utilize the opening enabled by circulation struggles to advance the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist cause? This utilization requires a full attendance to the unrolling conjuncture, rather than assuming the progressivism of seizure and interruption. After hearing my deployment of left third-worldism throughout the talk, you might think that a form of Marxism presupposing the linkage between capitalism and imperialism as two constitutive elements within the capitalist totality is not so unique. There were other Marxist frameworks that share similar presuppositions, namely, the Soviet Marxist accounts of imperialism like those of Lenin, Bukharin, Hilferding, Luxemburg, and Trotsky in the 1910s, the American monthly review tradition represented by figures like Paul Baran, Paul Sweezy, and Harry McDough in the late 1960s. Lastly, proponents of world system theory and dependency theory like Samir Amin, Andre Gunder Frank, Roy Mauro Marini, and Walter Rodney around the 1960s to 1970s. What I want to highlight is, the Soviet Marxists were not from the decolonizing third world. The monthly review tradition was scholarly, and many of the world system Marxists were not positioned in the Afro-Asian and tricontinental activist orbits in the 1960s. The left third-worldists, whose work I examined, for instance, Aim Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Ben Barkar, Fidel Castro, and Che Guevara, were theorizing as they were experiencing the world as left third-worldist subjects, forming their revolutionary subjectivities in the anti-colonial struggle. Left third-worldism sets itself apart from the anti-communist left-of-center, exemplified by Bandung and the non-aligned movement, and fascists as seen in the Asian people anti-communist league counterparts. Even though all these strands, left third-worldism, centrist third-worldism, and right or fascist third-worldism, converge around anti-imperialism. Left third-worldism differs from other third-worldist analyses in that the latter only discuss imperialism in itself without taking into account the capitalist imperative that necessitates imperialism, or to use Samir Amin's terms, accumulation and appetite on a world scale in the first place. Considering imperialism together with capitalism in a materialist framework, left third-worldism takes into account class composition and contradiction constituting the nation. Let me say it very clearly. I take left third-worldism to be a form of global South Marxism, radicalizing the Afro-Asian prospects of the anti-communist statist Bandung. The traditional praxis that most resonates with left third-worldism would be the anti-colonial practitioners in the interwar period, such as Jose Carlos Mariátegui, Mircea Sultan Galiev, Harry Haywood, C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, and even Antonio Gramsci, the figures who would not easily fit most of the existing Marxist categories. Of thinking with Ibrahim Isa on left third-worldism and circulation struggles is to think about left internationalism from below, that emerges from a specific struggle against imperialism and capitalism, rather than an imposed internationalism from the center or a struggle with a clear blueprint. I am not claiming that Isa was the first thinker who articulated this Marxist form of left third-worldism and circulation struggle, but I think the merit of his formulation was that they were grounded in the Indonesian geographical and historical conditions. Left third-worldism is indeed non-utopian and falsifiable praxis. Even as it aims to liberate another territory from neocolonialism, its defaulting to ethnocentric assimilationism was outright violent. Through the rhetoric and practice of left third-worldism internationally and anti-colonialism domestically, Indonesia expelled the Dutch colonizer to become yet another colonizer of West Papua that did not fully respect the desire for West Papuan self-determination. The limits of left third-worldism were its incapacity to deal with a contradiction emerging from the others within, as its handling methods were restricted to a few mostly oppressive measures. Last section, section 4, 2 more paragraphs and I'm done. I know I'm going a bit over time. The study of Ibrahim Isa's left third-worldism and circulation struggles is a part of my book project that develops a new processual understanding of Marxist internationalist praxis from the Indonesian periphery of global capitalism in the long 60s. The manuscript in progress, titled, and I also need feedback on this, whether it's catchy enough or whether it means anything to you, Bandung Radically, Peripheral Marxist History of Indonesian Left Internationalism, aims to animate the dialectical interplay between history and theory, a method I consider deployed by all excellent historical materialist scholarship that I admire. My manuscript advances Indonesian internationalist praxis emerging from tarrying with official communist constraints of dogmatism and revisionism, and their abstract conception of the third world as utopian semblance. I argue Indonesian left internationalism is a communist becoming that dialectically works through both capitalist and communist contradictions in the global periphery to prefigure a world emancipated from exploitation and expropriation. Peripheral Marxism is my term for an analytical frame capturing the dialectics of peripherality and internationalism as objective and subjective conditions for global revolutionary possibilities. Left third-worldism, exemplified by Ibrahim Isa in this talk, is one modality of peripheral Marxism. My project contributes to intellectual history of Marxism from the global south by conceiving Indonesia as the site of whole-producing world communism with other unanticipated global particulars like Egypt and Morocco, Malaya and North Kalimantan, and North Korea and Albania. It inherits the foundational principle of interpretive Southeast Asian studies that reject the treatment of Indonesia as a case study of Marxist modularity and Indonesians as mere data collector or native informant. Indonesian articulation of left internationalism was neither a mechanical reproduction of Western communism, nor a communism with Indonesian characteristics, but new communist praxis arising from the Indonesian co-production of global Marxism that my book proposes as left third-worldism and minor communist internationalism. My presupposition of Indonesia as generative site of knowledge co-production, Indonesians as dialectical theorists, and Indonesian left internationalists as communist becoming, subverts the long-standing phenomenon of epistemic dependency and epistemic racism in imperialist academia that subtract capacity for critical thinking from Asian bodies. I will end with 2 affirmative statements responding to the remaining academic imperialist discourse that I still hear circulating around 2023. Southeast Asians are global knowledge producers. The decolonization of Southeast Asian studies is possible and progressing in full force. My vision for the field moving forward is to remake global Southeast Asian studies, indeed where the joints are most vulnerable, into public justice scholarship, combining activist concerns with interdisciplinary research that uplift the livelihood of Southeast Asians, namely Southeast Asian studies for Southeast Asians.